Hey guys. So, this week and last week, we were taking a look at the history of racism here in the United States. We started by kind of taking a look at um, the Triangle Trade Route and the Atlantic slave system, where we see the different corruptions and systems put into place during the creation of our colonies, even getting us all the way up to kind of talking about the 1950s, post World War II era, as we're taking a look at this idea of racism and how it has played a major role in how race is viewed here in the United States. Okay, so we are starting to get up to that point in history where we are taking a look at some more current day issues. Um, and I want to make sure you guys know this that this is the first time you're kind of hearing me speak on this topic because previous to this, and even really this issue, I didn't feel like it was my topic to speak about. I mean, I'm sure you guys know this, but I am a white woman, and it has been my white privilege for the fact that I haven't had to deal with these systems. And my family hasn't had to deal with the systems put in place here in our country. And so, for most of this unit and speaking on the history of issues, I didn't feel like it was my place to share the experiences because I haven't experienced it. So I wanted to make sure I left these stories, these perspectives, up to the voices who they belong to. And the reason that I am taking over this lecture series more specifically is so that I can help you ease into ideas that you may not have heard before. Okay? And we're also combining some real big topics and kind of narrowing them down. So if I go over anything and you're like, wait a minute, I feel like I didn't get much out of that, or I want to know more, you are always welcome to take a look and research on your own. There's a ton of history, resources, firsthand accounts of the impact of some of the systems that we're going to look at today. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me through email. That's what I'm here for, is to answer some of those hard questions or things that you may be wondering about after hearing some of the things that I have to say. So, with that all in mind, let's get into this. I wanted to start this by having us specifically read the 13th and 14th Amendment. Okay, so these two amendments are going to play some major roles in some of the topics that we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint. So, in the 13th Amendment, which was ratified or officially voted, accepted upon, it was ratified in 1865. Okay, so we're looking at near the end of the United States Civil War. Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Okay, so some big things to point out here out of this amendment. Slavery has been outlawed in the United States or any place where we are overlooking the systems going on, except if it is a punishment for a crime where you have been convicted. So you've been in front of a jury, you've been in front of a judge, you've been convicted, found guilty. This amendment no longer applies to you. Okay, so that's something that a lot of people misunderstand about this amendment. Our 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, so officially accepted as law in 1868. Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So, we've got a couple of big things that happened with the passage of this amendment. First off, if you were born in the United States, you have now become a citizen of the United States. Previous to this, primarily African Americans and blacks, as well as Native Americans, were not considered citizens of the United States. So, following the passage of the 14th Amendment, this entire population has now become citizens. As far as what is required in order to protect citizens, you cannot deprive any person without first being without the due process of law. Okay? So, if you have been convicted of a crime, right, that's where that due process of law comes into place. If you've been convicted of a crime, 14th Amendment may not apply to you anymore. You may not have equal protection of the laws. Okay? So, we'll talk about this, and maybe you can come up with some ideas of how maybe this has played a role in the later institutions of systematic racism that we possibly still see today. So, our first topic is the idea of sharecropping. So, this was primarily kind of during our Reconstruction era, post-U.S. Civil War. Okay, obviously, all of these slaves had just been freed, they're now citizens, and the economy of the South is falling apart because they just lost all of their free workforce. So, what happens? Well, after the Civil War, there were laws passed granting 40 acres and a mule to any African American family or previous slave family, where now all of a sudden you've been freed and you've been given 40 acres and a mule or a horse to help jumpstart your family. Well, after Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson passed a law where any land that had been taken away from a plantation owner now went back to that plantation owner. So any land that previously may have been given to a former slave family is now going back to that plantation owner. But they primarily let those now free families rent out the small portion of land. And in return, that family has to give a portion of their crops or any money made from their crops back to the landowner at the end of the year, right? Like as a rent payment in order to stay and have some land to work off of. Now, at first, this sounded like a really good idea, the fact that a family has their own property, they're able to make their own money, have their own tools, their own house. But most of the time, these landowners were giving out tools that were necessary for farming, and the price to buy these tools was so high, or the price of rent for the land was so high, that these families were always going to be in debt. No matter how much crop they sold, how much money they made, they were always going to be in debt to these landowners. Therefore, creating this system of free workforce, kind of. Okay, so this primarily arose in the rural South, again during Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments, we have this system in place that again is kind of recreating that issue of slavery once again in the South. Okay, so in a lot of the southern states, we also see black codes popping up during Reconstruction. And black codes were different laws, regulations that were racist, where if you were a black person, you were not allowed to do certain things. And if you did those things, you were then convicted and you went to jail, or you had to sign into a contract as community service. Okay, so remember back to that 13th Amendment, right? Involuntary servitude is illegal except as a punishment for a crime if you have been duly convicted. Okay, so taking a look at those black codes, primarily the people that were going to be affected by it were black people, African Americans, and they are then being convicted, going to jail. Well, those prisons legally are able to outsource that labor, and those workers or those in jail are working for free. Okay, so primarily during Reconstruction in the South, what ethnicity is most likely to go to jail based on the laws that were being passed? I'm going to let you make that connection on your own. Heading a little bit more into the more current times. Okay, so last week you guys watched the documentary Eyes on the Prize, where you got to see some of the issues getting into desegregation and Jim Crow laws that were going on. Well, leading us up to 1954, we have our Supreme Court case, a landmark Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. Okay, so this issue was where a young girl, her father sued on her behalf. He was suing the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, because they would not allow his black daughter to join an all-white elementary school. Okay, so he sued based on the grounds of the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law. And he was saying that because of this system in place, which was separate but equal, his daughter was not able to receive a equal education to those of her counterpart, the white students at the elementary school. So this ended up going all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, where they ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional, and that any form of segregation based on race was inherently unequal. Okay, so this was a huge case that overturned a previous Supreme Court ruling that came about after the Civil War during that era of black codes and Reconstruction era. So this overturned that previous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case where a black man was getting onto a train car, and the train cars were divided based on ethnicity and race. So there was a whites-only car and colored-only cars. Now, this man got into the white-only car. He actually presented as a Caucasian, or as white, and it was ruled that he was enough African American that he needed to be riding in the colored car. Now, he took this to court and said, nope, I should be allowed to ride in whatever train car I want, and the courts ruled no. There can be separate cars, separate amenities, as long as the access is equal for both races. And this is where we really start to see that issue of whites only, colored only, bathrooms, drinking fountains, restaurants, busing, all of that. That's really where we see that racial segregation become legal, and we start to really see those systems become backed by law. Okay? So going back to Brown versus Board of Education, the court case that overturned the previous decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that separate was not equal, we start to see Justice Thurgood Marshall. Now, he ended up later on becoming the first black Supreme Court justice. He was the chief attorney for this case for Miss Brown. He was the head of the NAACP, and he's the one who was arguing that this was inherently unequal. Okay. Now, with this case, although the Supreme Court said on the federal national level, yes, you need to desegregate, we can't have anything based on race anymore because it's unequal, although they made that ruling, they don't really have a way to enforce their ruling, right? The Supreme Court, yeah, they can make decisions, but how do you enforce that decision making and the actions thereon? Well, they actually ended up leaving it up to the state and local school boards, where we're going to see some pretty bad riots occurring after this. Some states didn't even agree with the decision that was made by the Supreme Court, and there was heavy pushback by governors, local school board decision making. Parents, even, were blocking students of color from coming into previously white only schools. Okay, so this ended up causing a lot of problems, not only in the South, but there were also some major problems in the North. Okay, so systematic racism is not a Southern only issue. Many times we see a Great Migration, you may have heard it as, where we see a lot of African Americans moving to the North, expecting to have more freedoms and acceptance, and they weren't always greeted with that idea. And instead, the reality was that there was also racism in the North. Okay, so thinking about Michigan specifically, you may want to look up the issue of the Pontiac bus riots. Okay, so in the Pontiac school systems, which is kind of over by Detroit, just north of Detroit, parents were literally bombing school buses because they were so upset about the idea of intermixing the two races in schools. Okay, so go ahead, take a minute, look that up if you would like to. It's really interesting and it's something that we don't hear about as often. The next systematic issue that we want to take a look at is the issue of redlining. Okay, so in the 1920s, there was legal loopholes where we end up seeing these different commissions, boards, groups of decision makers creating zoning committees. And if you don't know this, sometimes there are committees that have to approve an application in order for you to move into a certain neighborhood. Okay, so these local boards during the 1920s were able to use loopholes in legislation in order to pass rules or standards of who could move in or apply to move into different towns or different neighborhoods of a city. And so one of the most common rules that was passed was preventing lower income families from being able to move into middle income neighborhoods. Primarily, if you think about that starting line, who is able to have a step ahead compared to someone else. And we really aren't that far away, generation-wise, from the end of the Civil War. So there's families that are still trying to get up on their feet. They're only one generation in, maybe, to having money in the first place, having a homestead to call their own. And so primarily, your lower income families are those of African American descent, or your black families. Okay, and so we see that a lot of applications for white families were the ones that were getting accepted, whereas our lower income families, primarily made up of African American families, were denied. And again, we see this system of segregation with housing and neighborhoods. And this is a system in place that ended up going even up until like the 1970s, okay, if not longer. So the reason that they call this redlining is because these zoning commissions or these committees would literally draw out on maps the incomes that were required in order for a family or a couple to move into a neighborhood. And most of the areas that were considered bad risk or hazardous were outlined in red. Okay, so as you can see here on this map that I've got on this slide, you've got your red neighborhoods. Again, these were hazardous, considered low income, a risk for getting a loan, meaning that like banks may not want to give out a loan or a mortgage to a family because they don't know if that family will be able to pay them back. Okay, so this is primarily, again, that system of segregation, legally allowed, but technically not segregating, right? Put quotation marks around that. And after World War II, we see a lot of white-only communities pop up because of this issue of redlining. where federally funded communities, such as Levittown, New York, were popped up and they were built on federal dollars in order to support soldiers and families coming home. Right? So many of these young men were coming back from war, starting their families. The United States kind of needed a place to help get these families up on their feet. And so they created these homes and they would approve different families to come in, thus creating these kind of white-only idealistic communities that you see a lot of pictures of in the 1950s and 60s. So again, if you want to know more, take a look at Levittown, New York. This is one of those really interesting situations of that legal, systematic racism that took place. Finally, as we kind of get closer into the more current day issues, we see the evolution of war on drugs. Okay, so in June of 1971, we have President Richard Nixon in office, and he officially makes the statement that he is declaring a war on drugs, where he believed that drug abuse was public enemy number one. Okay, so not only was President Nixon dealing with the Vietnam War, but also kind of issues of poverty here in the United States. And so his way of combating those two issues at once was to take a look at the war on drugs and see how it was affecting the two populations that were giving him the most problems. So because of this initiative, the war on drugs, we see the creation of the Drug Administration, and we start to see mandatory prison sentencing, where if you have evidence against you for this crime, a judge has to, they are mandated to give you a certain number of years based on the time period that is recommended by the federal government. Okay? So as these systems are coming into place, they are working, they're getting a lot of people who are committed or convicted for drug usage or selling of drugs. It looks like it's doing really well, and then we have an interview led by the domestic policy chief who worked under Richard Nixon. This is John Ehrlichman, okay, and he was doing an interview with Harper Magazine, where he was asked about President Nixon's motivation behind the war on drugs. And this is where I'd like you to take a minute and look at this quote that I've got here off to the right in the box. Okay, so John Ehrlichman, again the domestic policy chief working underneath Nixon, was quoted giving this statement to Harper Magazine. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So that sounds pretty bad, coming from one of the top people in the executive branch working directly underneath President Nixon, and someone who was instrumental in the war on drugs and the effects that it had in our country. Okay, so we see kind of maybe some motivations. Now, this was again one person's point of view on the motivation behind the war on drugs, but because of this interview, getting out and about, it led to this criticism and concerns about what the true focus was on drugs or the reform on drugs, especially what type of drugs had this mandatory minimum sentencing that we really see as even President Reagan comes into play. Okay, so 1986, again, we're seeing that mandatory minimum sentencing. And what people really questioned about the focus of this initiative was, why did certain different types of drugs have different sentencing? So heroin versus cocaine and crack cocaine versus powder cocaine all had different levels of sentencing. And when you take a look at primarily the different ethnicities that were using the different forms of the same type of drug, it really starts to raise the question of who has access to what type of drugs and what type of communities are these laws targeting. What type of communities are hit the hardest because of the laws that are put in place? While the initiative may have been created with good intentions, the idea that we were going to better society, it ended up, through this system, negatively impacting an entire generation of Black children, okay, in Black families, where all of a sudden you have kind of this absent father, absent parent model in families because of these mandatory minimums and drug selling, drug usage, and the type of drugs that were being targeted with these initiatives. So that just kind of all snowballs into some of the issues that we may still see today, whether that be our nation, our state, our own towns. Okay, so that's kind of that history, that system put in place that has not helped have an equal start at the race. Okay, so with that being said, we are going to continue into this unit by taking a look at some different examples of systematic racism, whether that be in education here in the North, and we're going to take a look at, again, some of the ideas of our civil rights movement leaders. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his ideas about activism. We're going to take a look at the idea of politics playing a role in racism and kind of where we're at in the conversation today. Obviously, it's a big deal in our society today, so I want to make sure we have those kind of conversations. Again, the point of this unit is to arm you with facts, education, so that way you can go out into the world and hopefully have better conversations and aren't as uncomfortable about having these different kind of conversations. So as always, please reach out if you have any concerns or questions. I recommend that you do some additional researching on some of the issues that have been brought up. Form your own opinions. Decide, do you agree, do you disagree? What is the historical facts behind some of these issues? What do people have to say about it? And then take a look at your community. Take a look at our state and a lot of our primarily Black communities around the nation. Are they affected by some of these policies? Yes, no. Again, make sure that you're using facts, using that historical knowledge, firsthand perspective, and then be educated about the decisions that you're having. As always, reach out if you have any concerns.